He confirmed Khamenei was dead, and then he carried on bombing. On Saturday afternoon from Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump opened Truth Social and issued a sequence of statements that marked a decisive escalation. He declared Khamenei, whom he described as one of the most evil people in history, was dead. He announced that most of Iran's senior leadership had been eliminated. He framed the moment as a historic opportunity for the Iranian people to reclaim their country. Then came the sentence that will be studied for decades. Trump wrote that the heavy and pinpoint bombing would continue uninterrupted throughout the week, or for as long as necessary, to achieve what he called peace across the Middle East, and indeed the world. A sitting head of state had been confirmed dead, and the bombing by presidential order would continue. Before dawn in Tehran, fresh explosions were reported, not only in Iran, but across the Gulf. Blasts were heard in Dubai, Doha, and Manama almost simultaneously. A second wave was underway. This was not a limited strike. It was not a 12-hour operation, nor a 24-hour one. This was the opening phase of an open-ended bombardment of a country of 90 million people, a country the U.S. president had already described as, in his words, very much destroyed, even obliterated, in a single day. For anyone who has followed this crisis from its earliest stages, the aircraft carriers, the sanctions, the deadlines, the backroom negotiations in Geneva, this moment was not the end of the story. It was the moment everything converged. What matters now is not what has happened, but what happens next. Because continued bombing is not the conclusion of this crisis. It is the beginning of its most dangerous chapter. To understand what comes next, it is necessary to look beyond the public statements. Trump's Truth Social post was the performance. His interview with Axios was the substance, the version delivered without slogans, where he spoke candidly about his thinking. He outlined two options. The first, he said, was to go long and take over the whole thing. Those words matter. Take over the whole thing is not the language of deterrence or non-proliferation. It is the language of occupation. It implies American forces on Iranian soil, administering a country twice the size of Texas, with 90 million people and one of the most battle-hardened proxy networks on Earth. The second option was to end it in 2 or 3 days, to tell Iran, in Trump's words, "See you again in a few years if you start rebuilding." That is not resolution. It is temporary devastation, a reset that openly anticipates future conflict. An acknowledgement that Iran would recover and that the United States would return. Then Trump said the most revealing line of all. He said that, in any case, it would take Iran several years to recover from the attack. Several years. That is not the language of a ceasefire, it is the language of scheduling. He was not describing how the war ends. He was describing when the next one begins. The assumption is built in, Iran will rebuild and America will be back. This is not a plan for peace. It is a maintenance strategy for destruction. Now consider the scale of what has already been done. While the Israeli military confirmed 7 senior Iranian figures killed, U.S. intelligence went further. A senior American intelligence official told CBS News that the strikes are believed to have killed approximately 40 Iranian officials in a single day. 40. To put that into perspective, the United States Senate has 100 members. Losing 40% of it in one morning would constitute national paralysis. In Iran's governing system, more concentrated, more hierarchical, and far more dependent on a narrow leadership class, the impact is even more severe. This is not a setback. It is decapitation. Trump himself told NBC News that the people who make the decisions were mostly gone, and the confirmed list reflects that. Khamenei is dead. Mohammad Pakpour, the IRGC commander, is dead. Amir Nasirzadeh, the defense minister, is dead. Mohammad Bagheri, chief of staff of the armed forces, is dead. Ali Shamkhani, senior advisor to the supreme leader and former national security chief, is dead, confirmed by Israel. 4 senior IRGC intelligence commanders are dead. Members of Khamenei's own family, his daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchild, are also dead. At a briefing, Benjamin Netanyahu was shown a photograph of Khamenei's body, not satellite imagery, a photograph. He confirmed there were growing signs the supreme leader was gone. Israel did not assassinate him in hiding or in flight. He was killed deliberately, in his own office, in his own home, while carrying out his duties. And now, 40 of the individuals a nation of 90 million looked to for direction are gone, eliminated in a single day. That is where this story begins. What emerged from that single day was not one Iran, but two. And this is the element no military briefing captures: the human and political divide that will determine whether Trump's call for the Iranian people to reclaim their country produces transformation or collapses into chaos. In Tehran, crowds gathered at Revolution Square holding photographs of Khamenei. They chanted in mourning. The government declared 40 days of national mourning and announced a state funeral at Tehran University. The IRGC released a statement describing Khamenei as a great leader, vowing that his death would only harden Iran's resolve. This grief is real. So is the anger. But at the same time, a very different Iran was visible. Quieter, harder to film, but no less real. The New York Times reported that in parts of Tehran, residents celebrated. Whistles were blown, ululations, the sharp, trilling cries Iranian women make in moments of joy, echoed in neighborhoods behind closed doors. With only 4% of the internet still functioning, messages spread privately, discreetly, among those who believed this moment represented liberation rather than loss. Outside Iran, the reaction was unmistakable. In Los Angeles, home to the largest Iranian community beyond Iran's borders, tens of thousands took to the streets. More than 200,000 Iranian Americans live in California alone. They carried pre-revolutionary Iranian flags, the lion and the sun, not the emblem of the Islamic Republic. These were symbols of the Iran that existed before 1979, the Iran represented by the exiled crown prince, Westwood Boulevard, Wilshire, the neighborhoods collectively known as Tehrangeles. For many, it felt like the end of a 47-year wait, a Saturday afternoon that hinted at a different future. These two Irans, one mourning, one celebrating, now exist simultaneously, and in the coming days they will collide inside Iran's borders in ways no American war plan is designed to manage. That collision is already being shaped by a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Under Iran's constitution, the death of a supreme leader triggers a clear process. First, an interim council assumes authority, composed of the president, the head of the judiciary, and a cleric from the Guardian Council. Second, the Assembly of Experts, 88 clerics, convenes to select a new supreme leader. Third, once appointed, that leader assumes full control over the military, the IRGC, the judiciary, foreign policy, and the nuclear program. On paper, the system is orderly. In reality, it is paralyzed. Step one exists only nominally. President Pezeshkian survived the strikes. He is alive, but the interim council has no authority over the IRGC. The guards answered directly to Khamenei, not to the presidency, and they have already acted independently, issuing statements without consulting the interim council or waiting for the Assembly of Experts, praising Khamenei and pledging to continue his path. The IRGC is not waiting for constitutional procedure, it is self-authorizing. Step two is physically impossible. The Assembly of Experts cannot safely convene in Tehran. American and Israeli aircraft are actively striking Iranian territory. The 88 clerics are dispersed across the country. Communications are operating at 4% of normal capacity. Gathering under active bombardment to conduct a formal session and select a new supreme leader cannot happen today. It may not happen this week. And that leads to step three, the most dangerous absence of all. Without a supreme leader, no one has constitutional authority to order the IRGC to stand down. No one can accept a ceasefire. No one can authorize negotiations. The body required to approve peace does not exist. It cannot assemble under bombs. Meanwhile, the organization that possesses the weapons, the discipline, and the will to fight is operating outside the constitutional framework designed to restrain it. Trump eliminated the one individual capable of ordering Iran to stop, and there is no successor positioned to replace that authority. Then came the most diplomatically revealing development of the day, largely overlooked. Oman's foreign minister publicly expressed dismay at the U.S. strikes. This was not just any official reaction. He is the man who appeared on CBS News 24 hours earlier saying a deal was within reach. The man who flew to Washington on Friday to meet J.D. Vance. The man who carried messages between Tehran and Washington through 3 rounds of Geneva negotiations. His choice of word matters, not condemnation, not a demand for a ceasefire, dismay. That is the language of a mediator who was blindsided, and the implications are severe. If Oman was not informed in advance, if its foreign minister left Washington believing diplomacy was progressing and woke up in Muscat to bombs falling on Tehran, then the back channel was not paused, it was burned. At the very moment he was still speaking publicly about negotiations, the operation had already begun. The one door Iran deliberately kept open by sparing Oman in its retaliation may now be closed, not by Tehran, but by Washington's timing. That single word, dismay, spoken by that man on that day, may be the quietest and most devastating sentence in this entire crisis. What followed was a political shockwave inside Washington, one that moved faster than any congressional response to military action in recent memory. The operation had been launched without congressional authorization, without a vote, and without prior notification. Under the War Powers Resolution, the president is required to inform Congress within 48 hours of committing U.S. forces to hostilities. Trump ordered the strikes, branded Operation Epic Fury, on Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, before the bombing had even paused, members of Congress were already demanding action. PBS News reported that lawmakers were calling for an immediate vote on a war powers resolution following strikes carried out without congressional approval. Senator Tim Kaine, long regarded as the Senate's most consistent enforcer of war powers limits, described the operation as a massive violation. Representative Ro Khanna called the strikes unconstitutional. Republican Thomas Massie joined the criticism, as did fellow Republican Warren Davidson. This was not a partisan eruption, it was institutional. Democrats were broadly unified in condemnation. Some Republicans, though fewer, openly expressed concern. And the numbers matter. If a war powers resolution passes, the president would be required to end hostilities within 60 days. It is not equivalent to a declaration of war, but it forces a recorded vote, a public reckoning. Every member of Congress would be on record deciding whether the United States should continue bombing Iran all week uninterrupted, as the president promised. While Washington argued over legality, the war itself moved into its second phase. The first wave, roughly 900 American strikes, 200 Israeli aircraft, more than 500 targets, dominated the headlines. But the second wave revealed the true ambition of the campaign. Before dawn on Sunday in Tehran, CBS News confirmed that the United States and Israel had launched another round of strikes. U.S. Central Command released aerial footage, unclassified and deliberate, showing the destruction of multiple target categories. Drones destroyed on runways, radar towers flattened, missile batteries eliminated, entire compounds reduced to rubble. This footage was not leaked. It was released. It was information warfare, designed to demonstrate capability and inevitability. The message was directed not at the public, but at Iran's surviving military leadership. This is what precision-guided munitions do to hardened infrastructure, and the target list had shifted. The first phase focused on decapitation, leadership, command figures, senior officials. The second phase was about dismantlement. Trump had already stated the objective clearly. Iran's missile industry would be razed to the ground, its navy annihilated, IRGC command and control facilities destroyed, air defenses eliminated, missile and drone launch sites neutralized, military airfields rendered unusable. This was no longer about removing individuals. It was about erasing capability, one category at a time, all week, uninterrupted. Trump made that logic explicit in an interview with CBS News' Robert Costa. Asked whether a diplomatic solution remained possible, Trump replied, easily. He added that it was much easier now than it had been a day earlier, because Iran was, in his words, getting beat up badly. This is the negotiating worldview of a man shaped by decades in real estate. You apply pressure first. You impose cost. Only then do you offer relief. Trump is not proposing peace before the bombing. He is offering peace through it. International law does not work this way, but this crisis may, because Trump has already outlined his off-ramps. Either go long and take over the whole thing, or end it in 2 or 3 days. Either way, he assumes Iran will take several years to recover. The rebuilding is anticipated. The return is pre-calculated. There is a version of this crisis in which Iran, leaderless, bombed, economically crippled, its missile forces degraded and navy shattered, reaches through whatever diplomatic channel remains and delivers the sentence Trump has been demanding since February. We will never have a nuclear weapon. In that scenario, the bombing stops. Trump declares victory. Iran begins to recover. And in several years, by Trump's own timeline, the United States comes back when rebuilding begins. This is not regime change. It is not occupation. It is managed destruction, followed by a declaration of peace that openly acknowledges the underlying conflict has merely been postponed. Meanwhile, the regional consequences are unfolding in real time. Before dawn, fresh explosions were reported in Dubai, Doha, and Manama, 3 Gulf cities hit simultaneously. This was the second morning of retaliation for capitals that went to bed under missile threat and woke again to uncertainty. Iran's internet remains at 4% capacity. Its airspace is closed. The Strait of Hormuz has not been mined, but 3 major tanker operators confirmed to Reuters that they have voluntarily suspended all transits, not because ships have been hit, but because operating in Iranian waters during an active U.S.-Israeli bombardment is now considered uninsurable. Insurance premiums for Gulf shipping have surged by 400%. That figure matters. It reflects underwriters' assessment that a strike is no longer a remote risk. It is a central scenario. When Asian markets opened on Sunday, Brent crude jumped immediately. Analysts agree on the consequences of even partial disruption in the strait. Oil prices between $140 and $180 per barrel. Saudi Arabia has announced increased production. The United States is preparing a strategic petroleum reserve release. Emergency mechanisms weeks in the making are now being activated, not as a precaution, but as a response to a threat the market is already pricing in. And that brings us to the most revealing claim Trump has made, and the least analyzed. He said the United States is hearing that many IRGC military, security, and police forces no longer want to fight and are seeking immunity from America. That is not simply a claim of battlefield success. It is a political strategy. This is the Venezuela model. When U.S. pressure culminated in the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the bombing stopped immediately. Talks began, oil flowed, relations shifted. For Iran, that model requires one thing: a surviving IRGC figure with enough authority to speak for the organization and enough self-interest to calculate that personal survival now depends on reaching out to Washington. Ali Larijani, one of the most senior civilian figures to survive the initial strikes, has vowed retaliation. That is not an immunity request, but Trump's claim is not about civilians. It is about internal military communication. If that intelligence is accurate, if commanders inside the IRGC are quietly weighing Washington's offer of immunity against the certainty of annihilation, then the off-ramp is no longer theoretical. It is active. And the next 48 hours will determine whether anyone takes it. Trump's stated objectives leave little room for ambiguity. He has said the United States will destroy Iran's missile program and level its missile industry. He has said Iran's Navy will be annihilated. He has confirmed that American forces are targeting IRGC command and control facilities, air defense systems, missile and drone launch sites, and military airfields. This is not a campaign limited to leadership figures. It is a systematic effort to dismantle Iran's entire military-industrial capacity. Every factory, every base, every launch site, one category at a time, all week without pause. The logic behind this approach was laid bare in Trump's interview with Robert Costa. When asked whether a diplomatic solution remained possible, Trump replied, "Easily." He then added that it was far easier now than it had been a day earlier, because Iran was, in his words, getting beat up badly. This is not the language of international diplomacy, it is the language of leverage. Trump's worldview is shaped by decades of transactional negotiation. You do not offer terms first. You impose cost. You weaken the other side's position until agreement becomes the least painful option available. Peace, in this framework, does not precede violence. It follows it. The bombing is not a failure of diplomacy. It is the mechanism through which diplomacy is forced. Whether that logic conforms to international law is almost beside the point. It may nonetheless determine how this crisis ends. Trump has already outlined the exit ramps. He can prolong the operation and take control of the entire situation, or he can end it within 2 or 3 days. In either case, he assumes Iran will take several years to recover. That assumption is central. Recovery is expected. Rebuilding is anticipated. And so is a future confrontation. There is a plausible end state in which Iran, stripped of leadership, heavily bombed, economically crippled, its missile forces degraded, and its navy destroyed, reaches through whatever diplomatic channel remains and delivers the sentence Trump has been demanding for months, that it will never pursue a nuclear weapon. In that version of events, the bombing stops. Trump declares victory, Iran begins to rebuild, and by Trump's own timeline, the United States returns years later when rebuilding crosses an unacceptable threshold. The problem is not resolved, it is deferred. This is not regime change, it is not occupation, it is controlled devastation, followed by a declaration of peace that acknowledges, implicitly, that the underlying conflict remains intact. Meanwhile, the regional consequences are already unfolding. On the second morning of the campaign, explosions were reported in Dubai, Doha, and Manama, 3 Gulf capitals struck before dawn. These were cities that had gone to bed under threat and woke again to uncertainty. Inside Iran, the internet remains at 4% of normal capacity. The country's airspace is closed. The Strait of Hormuz has not been mined, but 3 major tanker operators confirmed they have voluntarily halted all transits. Not because ships have been attacked, but because operating in Iranian waters during an active American-Israeli bombardment is now deemed uninsurable. That assessment is reflected in the numbers. Insurance premiums for Gulf shipping have risen by 400%. This is not a marginal adjustment. It signals that underwriters believe a strike on commercial shipping is no longer a remote possibility. It is a core risk. When Asian markets opened, oil prices jumped immediately. Analysts are broadly aligned. Even partial disruption in the strait would push crude prices into the $140 to $180 range. Saudi Arabia has announced increased production. The United States has signaled it is preparing a release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. These emergency mechanisms were put in place weeks ago. They are now being activated because the threat is no longer hypothetical. It is being priced in. And then there is the claim Trump made that may prove the most consequential of all. He said the United States is hearing that many members of Iran's military, security services, and police no longer want to fight and are seeking immunity from America. This is not merely a statement of military success. It is a political signal. It mirrors the Venezuela precedent. When pressure reached its peak and Nicolas Maduro was captured, hostilities stopped immediately. Negotiations began. Oil production resumed. Relations shifted. For Iran, that model requires one critical condition: a surviving senior figure within the IRGC who possesses both the authority to speak for the organization and the self-interest to conclude that survival now depends on disengagement. Some senior civilian figures have vowed retaliation. That is expected. But Trump's claim does not concern public rhetoric. It concerns private calculations within the security apparatus itself. If commanders inside the IRGC are assessing their personal survival odds and concluding that an American offer of immunity is preferable to commanding an organization being dismantled from the air, then the off-ramp Trump describes is not theoretical. It is operational. And the next 48 hours will determine whether anyone inside that system is prepared to take it.